Inside Texas Politics, 3rd edition by Brandon Rottinghause. Chapter 14, Part 3. 14.4 Education. The Texas Constitution requires that the state to provide efficient and adequate funding for its public schools. School finance is the toughest political issue the state faces because historically it has been the most expensive service the state provides. Students, parents, and school districts have fought the battle over education through the state legislature, the courts, and bureaucratic agencies. Sources of K-12 funding. Schools are funded by a combination of state general revenue, local property taxes, and some federal taxes. The permanent school fund contains money from a long-term investment the state made in 1854. The state initiated the fund with a $2 million appropriation and set aside land whose proceeds go expressively into public school funding. In addition, 1/4 of taxes on the production of fossil fuels and 1/4 of the gas, water, and electric utility taxes are constituently dedicated to public education. Much of the proceeds from the state lottery are also earmarked for education. The state provides extra funds for students who need more support. The Foundation School Fund is a briefcase for holding general revenue funds allocated by the legislature and appropriated to the Texas Education Agency to administer. The available school fund is the separate pool of revenue schools allocated annually from the permanent school fund earnings and from 1/4 of the state's motor fuel tax revenue. And individual schools receive money through a complicated formula that includes the number of students in class attendance plus extra funding for specific students like those with learning disabilities, gifted and talented students. Low-income students or those learning English, districts can also increase their pool of available funds locally by holding a bond referendum election that, if approved, can fund the district's construction projects, repairs, or technology upgrades. Critics of this system argue that it creates two districts, rich and poor. School finance. Despite attempts to identify additional funds to increase spending on public education, the issue of school finance is perpetually on the table in the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez in 1973. The court found that the school finance system relied too heavily on property taxes, which produced considerable inequities in state aids to education. As the fundamental right to a quality public education only existed in the Texas Constitution, however, and did not the U.S. Constitution, the court found no violation of federal law. Since 1984, school districts have sued the state 7 times over perceived inadequate funding, over-reliance on property taxes to fund education, and unequal distribution of education funds prompted to the Texas Supreme Court to proclaim the state school finance system unconstitutional in 1989 in Edgewood Independent School District versus Kirby. The court determined that the system enabled rich districts to raise and spend far more money than poor districts. Lawyers for the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund represented Demetrio Rodriguez of San Antonio, and his family argued that there was a $500,000 difference in the property value taxed per student between the poorest and richest district. Lawmakers in 1991 created a new system which they believed would fix the problem. First dubbed Recapture, then the Fair Share Plan. And finally, Robin Hood, the current school finance structure, redistributes tax money from wealthy school districts to poorer ones. The plan is the first constitutionally permissible school funding formula in 30 years. However, the Robin Hood plan is disliked by many districts, especially the wealthier ones that have to send extra funds to the state. School districts are guaranteed to a formula-driven funding amount dictated by statutorily determined set amount per student, the basic allotment, enrollment in special programs, special education, English as a second language (ESL), gifted and talented, and a cost of education index, since costs are higher in some areas of the state than in others. This so-called Tier 1 money, Tier 2 funds depend on how high the tax rate is for the school district. The first 6 cents of the tax rate above the minimum rate, called pennies, are golden, not subject to recapture, but the tax rate above those golden pennies from 7 to 17%, 7 to 17 copper pennies are subject to recapture to distribute to school districts with less revenue, equalizing spending across a giant state with widely different local revenue, from rich suburbs to poor inner cities, is difficult. The state is forced to use some general revenue from sales taxes to pay for schools, making school funding subject to uncertain budgets and political infighting. A reform effort in 2003 to replace the Robin Hood plan, which included a payroll tax, a restructuring of the franchise tax, and increased taxes on gambling, failed when Republicans howled about higher taxes and Democrats complained about education being paid for with gambling, an unstable source of revenue. 2/3 of the state school tax districts, again charging that the system was underfunded, filed another suit that landed in Texas courts in 2014. The Texas Supreme Court in 2016 found that the state's school finance system was imperfect, and while it had immense room for improvement, it did meet constitutional requirements. The court urged the legislator to make transformational changes rather than just apply temporary Band-Aid. Texans deserve transformation, top to bottom reforms that amount to more than Band-Aid and Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid, and a revamped system fit for the 21st century. This is a challenging issue because over the years the state has outlined 3 broad tests to ensure that the system is constitutional: suitability, efficiency, and adequacy. See figure 14.4. Major spending cuts to education in 2011 totaled $5 billion in Texas, in Texas, forcing local cuts of up to 10%, which meant laying off teachers, increasing class sizes, and reducing other staff, such as tutors and instructional specialists. After critics charged that the state share of funding was frozen in time, and former education focused legislators called out yellow belly politicians to save Texas public schools, state lawmakers agreed to let rising local property tax revenues fill the gap in state spending on public education. The decision frustrated taxpayers and robbed school kids. State lawmakers returned much of that money as they passed a sweeping bill to dramatically increase the state's share of public school funding per student by 20% in the 2020 biennial budget. Average state spending on education rose from 2008 to 2019. a $1,486 per pupil increase. See Figure 14.3. State law limits class sizes to 22 students. Although more than 6,000 waivers were granted to allow school districts to exceed this amount, school districts also may lose sources of funding because industries can take advantage of tax breaks that enable them to reduce their property tax obligations. This deal closing program allows local governments to cut deals for companies to move to an area and pay fewer property taxes. The major source of school funding, these deals have cost $7 billion in tax revenue in the past 17 years. The mayor of Texas City, Texas, claimed that Valero Energy Corporation, through its tax break receiving refinery, was robbing millions of dollars from local school kids. In response, proponents argued that such incentives keep local economies thriving and attract new businesses to an area. Teacher, student, and school performance. In 1984, the Texas legislature passed a major reform bill that raised teacher salaries but tied them to teacher performance. The reforms also introduced more stringent teacher certification, limited elementary school classrooms, sorry about that. Feel free to pause for Figure 14.3. 33 students began competency testing for educators, initiated stricter attendance standards, and adopted a no pass, no play rule that prohibited students with failing grades from participating in extracurricular activities. Governor Mark White, who initiated the efforts with the help of Dallas billionaire H. Ross Perot, took the credit and then the blame for the reforms. Anger was directed especially at the no pass, no play restrictions upheld by the Texas Supreme Court, which ruled that students had no constitutional right to participate in sports. High school coaches were not the only ones upset, even though the legislation included pay raises. Teachers were also angered over the provisions that required them to pass a competency test to keep their jobs. Mock tests circulated at the time asked the following sample questions. What comedy team had the greatest success in Texas since 1984? Laurel and Hardy, Amos and Andy, Tarzan and Cheetah, or White and Perot? And which of the following describes an educational expert in Texas? Here, only one answer is offered: a billionaire with a burr in his A. Lieutenant Governor Bill Hobby became so irate that he called in the teachers group to have it out with them. A state senator who attended the meeting characterized the situation as being like the Alamo, but without the blood. In the 1986 election, the Texas State Teachers Association lined up against Governor White, despite the fact that the 97% of the teachers passed the competency provisions, which according to Texas Monthly were so easy that only people who have trouble reading and understanding English are likely to fail. Combined with a slumping economy and unpopular tax increases, the governor lost his re-election bid, but many of the reforms from 1984 remain in place. Parents are another major interest group in the education process. Reforms in 1995 cemented local control over schools by limiting the state's Texas Education Agency to broad education goal planning, managing the school funds account, and administering the accountability system. A decade later, beginning with the class of 2005, the state mandated the Texas student to pass an exit level test to meet graduation requirements. currently called the State of Texas Assessment of Academic Readiness Tests, or STAR. The percentage of students passing the test declined or remained flat from 2016 to 2017, with 70% of 3rd through 8th graders statewide meeting the grade level. Why does this matter? The results carry significant weight for 5th and 8th graders who must pass the test to move to the next grade. Backlash over exit level testing peaked in 2015 as parents complained that the state put too much emphasis on the test. The legislators softened the test requirements and allowed graduates who passed 2 of their 5 end-of-course exams to graduate. Rating schools is difficult because there are many ways to do so. Since 1993, Texas has rated its schools in one way or another. The most recent incarnation, beginning in the 2017-2018 school year, assigns letter grades A, B, C, D, or F, rather than the MET standards or improvement required labels used before this system was established. In 2016, the Texas Supreme Court held the Texans deserve transformation, top to bottom reforms that amount to more than Band-Aid on the top of Band-Aid and a revamped system. Fit for the 21st century, this is a challenging dilemma because over the years the state has outlined 3 broad tests to ensure the system is constitutional. Suitability, efficiency, and adequacy. See figure 14.4. Nationally, Texas education consists ranks lower than that of most other states. Education Week gave Texas a C overall, a C for K through 12 student achievement, a C for student future success in life, and a D plus for school finance. This put Texas in the 41st place nationally. Texas was not alone in getting low grades. North Carolina, Nevada, and Oregon all scored a C- overall or worse. Diversity in public education. Excuse me. The makeup of state schools has grown increasingly diverse as the state matures and changes demographically. In recent decades, Texas schools have grown larger, now at 5.2 million public school kids. Less white due to a rise in the state's Hispanic and Asian populations, and poorer. Many Texas public schools remain as a segregated, either almost all Anglo, African American, or Hispanic, as they were in the 1970s. When the landmark legislation sought to end racial segregation in schools, this presents challenges as well as opportunities. Texas schools are allowed to file misdemeanor charges against students who skip school, and the fines can range up to $500 plus court costs. Excuse me. Race may play a role in determining who get charged. However, Ashley Brown, a 16-year-old African-American sophomore from South Oak Cliff High School in Dallas, missed 4 days of school after her grandmother died of cancer. The school mistakenly charged her with more absences and she had to appear in court. The court ultimately dismissed the charges, but Ashley's case is not uncommon in Texas. African Americans are more likely than Latinos or Anglos to be suspended from school. 35% of suspensions in pre-K through 2nd grade were African American students compared to Anglo students at 27% and Latino students at 34%. The legislature has now banned out-of-school suspensions of kindergarten through 2nd grade. and some districts have increased resources to help teachers with students who need emotional or behavioral support. Another complication is the growing dropout rate among the state's poor and Hispanic students. African Americans have the highest dropout rates, 8.3%, followed by Hispanics 6.9%, multiracial 4.6%, and Anglo students 3.3%. Such problems put many students on this school to prison pipeline and contribute to an undereducated Texas. The solutions applied including identifying dropout factory schools that graduate less than 60% of their students and intervening early for a student at risk of dropping out. In recent years, because of these strategies, the performance gap between Anglo students and African Americans and Hispanic students has narrowed. See Table 14.1. Low income and minority students were also hit harder than peers as school districts across the state scrambled to move instruction online during the COVID outbreak. Teachers planted "My teachers miss me" signs in the yards of missing students, but tens of thousands did not participate in online instruction. One reason Hispanic students have lagged behind is language. The state has been under legal scrutiny since the 1970s for failing to adequately fund English language learner education. Texas public schools had almost 1 million English as second language ESL students in 2019. Some school districts have begun more rigorously tracking the amount of time ESL students spend learning English, using periodic testing to make more students understand academic concepts in English and furnishing the Ferrari of bilingual education programs where all students learn in both English and Spanish. If a district has even one school campus that chronically fails to meet the state standards for 5 or more years, no excuses, legislation passed in 2015 allows the Education Commissioner to close campuses, replace the district's elected officials, or take over the district itself. In 3 takeovers, El Paso ISD, 59,400 students, Beaumont ISD, 19,200 students, and Houston ISD, 209,772 students. The Texas Education Commissioner dismissed the elected school board and replaced its members with local community leaders. The results of these takeovers have been mixed. Budgets have been balanced and leadership fissures have been repaired, but few changes have significantly raised student achievement rates. Vouchers. One approach to public education to make private schools more accessible through vouchers, the school choice, or where the dollars follow the child. Voucher programs provide a student with authorization for government funding to be used at a private school. Opponents argue that vouchers divert funding and therefore hurt public schools while aiding just a small number of private school students. Proponents claim that vouchers make schools work harder to attract students. On several occasions in the past few sessions, the legislature has attempted but failed to pass tax credits, a form of voucher for Texans who send their children to private school to get rebate. Special education. Across the country, 13% of students on average are identified in needing or special education, and every student eligible for special ed has a right to receive it under federal law. Federal courts have charged that in placing an arbitrary 8.5% cap of total enrollment on the number of students who could receive special education services. Texas has failed to fulfill its child find responsibility to locate children with disabilities entitled to these services that CAP put into place in 2004, punish districts that went over it. A Texas education agency reversed course and required local school districts to find and help the thousands of students who had been left out of special education. Still, administrators are concerned with the $65 million provided to accomplish this objective will not keep up with demand for services. Bullying. In 2018, a businessman strode to the lectern at a public forum during a board meeting of the Katy IASD and accused Superintendent Lance Hint of bullying him while in middle school 40 years earlier by taunting him about his name, Gay, which he later changed to Barrett, and shoving his head into a urinal. Superintendent Hint denied these allegations, but the incident highlighted the lingering effect of bullying on young Texans. Texas has taken a get tough approach to bullying in public school classrooms. Indeed, the climate surrounding bullying, once thought to be just part of growing up, has changed dramatically. Each school district is required to have a policy that prohibits bullying or harassment and to ensure that district employees enforce these provisions. Legislation passed in 2017 called David's Law, named after a 16-year-old student from San Antonio who took his own life after being cyberbullied, makes it a crime to cyberbully someone in Texas if it leads to injury or suicide of a minor. It also allows teachers to discipline students who bully other students off campus or online, thereby acknowledging the reach of this problem beyond the classroom. 14.5 Higher education. Texas also funds and sets standards for higher education institutions. Marabou B. Lamar, known as the father of Texas education, is credited with the idea of establishing state support for higher education. In 1839, he outlined his vision for a public university system and professed a cultivated mind as the guardian genius of democracy. Funding. The Permanent University Fund, PUF, was established in 1839, even before Texas had university. The screwland of the state aside wasn't worth much until oil was struck. Proceeds from natural oil resources, oil, gas, sulfur, water, mineral leases, and grazing rights generated income for the fund and for permanent members. Campuses of the University of Texas and Texas A&M University. The fund was set up in 1931 to provide 2/3 of its income to UT and 1/3 to A&M. With a boom in oil revenue pumping more than $1 billion a year into PUF, the universities are flushed with funds and have seen their endowments grow by 70% since 2014. The fund, currently worth more than an estimated $19 billion, although that number is expected to flatline as oil prices plateau due to a dip in demand during the COVID-19 outbreak. The substantial wealth benefiting some of the state's universities have the rest of the universities calling foul. Texas is not just driven by UT and A&M. State Representative Sylvester Turner, Democrat of Houston, opened during a hearing of the House of Committee on Appropriations. Representative Turner filed legislation to open up the PUF to state schools other than UT and A&M, which routinely received double or triple the amount of funding other schools receive.
Opponents argue that the state established the PUF to fund the state's flagship universities only. This creates a system that advantages only two state universities despite broad resources. Defenders of the current system argue that the state has expanded the institutions allowed to access the PUF, like additional UT campuses and A&M research centers, for the good of the state. Texas only has 8 Tier 1 universities, 4 of which became Tier 1 in 2016, compared to 9 in California. Tuition at public universities was set by the legislature until 2003, when a law was passed to allow individual universities to raise or lower tuition, called deregulation. As tuition has risen at all public schools, legislators have grumbled that they need to be regulated again. Yet the rate of tuition increase in the years since deregulation has been lower than the rate of increase in the decade before deregulation. Higher tuition can contribute to growing student debt. The class of 2019 graduated college with a $26,824 in student loan debt on average. However, the problem is not just a problem for recent graduates. More than 222,000 Texans older than 60 years of age had student debt in 2017. Community colleges. The most explosive growth in higher education has come from community colleges in Texas. Enrollment in these two-year institutions has risen 98% since 1990, totaling 685,831 students in 2018. These colleges educate many students. More than 50% of students enrolled in public higher education are in a community college. As discussed in Chapter 12, these institutions are funded by taxes from locally elected community college boards, about $2.1 billion in 2018. Both are supplemented with funds from legislature for operations for instructional programs, about $1.8 billion in the 2020 and 2021 biennium. A portion of the legislative funds are tiered to a student success points that assign point values for student-specific objectives, such as passing a math course, the first time being awarded a degree in a critical field, and transferring to a four-year university. Standards. With growing demand for a college-educated workforce and the sprouting of colleges and the universities across the Lone Star State, the Texas Commission on Higher Education was created in 1953, followed by establishment of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, the THECB. In 1965, to coordinate, develop, and evaluate Texas higher education, the THECB primarily approves construction of facilities, reviews and coordinates degree programs, and assists institutions of higher educations with student retention and success issues. Does the state need more nurses, veterinarians, or big data scientists? The THECB is responsible for assessing the need for additional programs and for funneling students into them. Institutions driven by local concerns and alumni may have different objectives than the state, increasing enrollment or degrees for their own sake. Powerful university lobbyists often circumvent the THECB by going to their legislature directly for funding help, increasing tensions between state resources. the THECB, and institutions of higher education. Affirmative action. Abigail Fisher, a Sugar Land, Texas student, dreamed of attending UT, like her father and sister had before her. Her high school grades, test scores, volunteer efforts, and cello playing were not enough. However, as the university, she argues, rejected her application because of the top 10% rule. This rule opens up educational opportunities by giving all racial and ethnic minority students who graduate in the top 10% at any Texas school, regardless of its rank or performance, automatic admission into a Texas public university. Arguing with her rejection was discriminatory based on race. Fisher sued the university. The University of Texas, as well as other schools, have used affirmative actions, a series of rules and procedures designed to give minorities a leg up by offering advantages in education or employment to specific groups to readdress historic discrimination. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the university's affirmation action program in 2016 in Fisher versus the University of Texas, allowing UT to continue considering a prospective student's race as one factor among many to ensure a diverse student body. Even so, Latino enrollment has nearly tripled in Texas, but only about half of these students end up earning a bachelor's degree. 14.6 Transportation. Tired of sitting in traffic? You're not alone. Road conditions and traffic issues affect all Texans in one way or another. Several Texas cities are ranked near the top for the worst commutes, and more than 1 million Texans living in and around major metropolitan cities commute annually. Transportation is often cited as the number one issue of concern for Texans, especially in big cities. The Texas Department of Transportation argues that it needs an additional $5 billion annually to maintain the current roads. Highway funds come mainly from motor vehicle registration fees, federal highway funds, the sales tax on motor oils, and some part of the motor fuel gas taxes. These make up the state highway fund. With a small appetite to spend funds on transportation, lawmakers use toll roads as a way to develop and maintain road projects. For large projects like the expansion of the LBJ Expressway in Dallas, toll revenue is critical to funding the project's completion. But while Texans want more funding for roads, they don't want to pay for it with tolls. Opposition from fellow Republicans was enough to stop on of Governor Rick Perry's 2001 solutions to the state's transportation woes. The Trans-Texas Corridor, a now 4,000-mile nexus of privately owned, operated toll roads that would have crisscrossed the state. The price tag was to be $175 billion. A 2014 constitutional amendment kicks in $1.7 billion yearly, although this is subject to economic variability, because these funds are related to taxes on oil and natural gas production. Until funding shortages are resolved and congestion subsides, Texas drivers are going to be stuck behind the wheel in traffic. Even with all this money, experts still point to Texas transportation deserts, whereas areas where people who are too young, too old, too poor, or disabled cannot drive and live with unreliable public transportation. See figure 14.5. Dependence on public transportation limits jobs opportunities and upward economic mobility in Texas. To improve the options of these tens of thousands of transit-dependent Texans, analysts recommend redesigning bus services by adding new lines, expanding service hours, and integrating bicycle with other transit services. That expansion comes with a cost. Texas has not had a death-free day on its roads in 20 years. In an effort to reduce fatalities, cities have improved sidewalk and street design, more strictly enforced traffic laws, and provided education about roadway safety. Feel free to pause for figure 14.5. 14.7, Energy and the environment. The balance between concern over the environment and the promotion and regulation of energy sources reaches back generations. The political struggle between urban and rural interests also plays into regulating Texas' environment. Water. Since 2010, Texas has experienced drought conditions, draining reservoirs used for water, fueling wildfires and dust storms, and limiting water for agricultural use. At the height of the drought, cattle feed prices skyrocketed. Rice farm output, water is used to soak the crop, tumbled. Corn output fell 40%, and peanut production dropped. Less water in the Rio Grande closed the tap on fast-growing border areas around El Paso that rely on the river for water, resulting in fewer healthy pastures and loss of livestock. More than 1,000 areas in Texas enacted water restrictions, since the amount of water a single-family household uses to water its yard could fill 590,000 football fields with 1 foot of water. Arlington banned watering between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. year-round, and San Angelo reduced watering to once a week. A report from the organization Water Conservation by the Yard Fund that Texas could cut municipal water use by almost 9% of all its municipalities adopted these year-round outdoor watering restriction. The real danger facing Texas, however, lies in the present, but in the future as water demand surpasses dwindling existing water supplies. See figure 14.6. The Texas Water Developing Board. In 1957, after a 7-year dry spell, the legislature founded an agency that would become the Texas Water Development Board, the TWDB, to provide loans to local governments for water projects, administer water funds, and facilitate the transfer and sale of water and water rights throughout the state. The TWDB has promoted more efficient irrigation practices and the use of natural rainfall, with the result that irrigation water demands are projected to fall by almost 18% between 2020 and 2070. Unfortunately, population growth is likely to increase the demand on municipal water for drinking, bathing, and other purposes by 62%. Cities and suburbs are thirsty for more water. Parched rural agricultural lands needs water for irrigation. It's no surprise that instead of reflecting the polarized Republican versus Democrat politics, the water politics divide is between rural and urban or suburban interests. Rural representatives worry that cities will pay more for water and leave rural areas dry. Republican Representative Drew Darby, arguing for rural Texas' fair share of the state's evaporating water supply, pointed out that they don't grow cotton at Men's Warehouse in San Antonio. They don't feed beef at the HEB in San Antonio. The food, the fiber, the natural resources are produced in rural Texas. The rain quells the water problem in more ways than one. In 2015, voters overwhelmingly approved allocating $2 billion from the state rainy day fund to a water fund for projects approved by the TWDB. 20% of the fund was earmarked for conservation projects and 10% was set aside for rural water projects. The projects included building new reservoirs, fixing pipes, and pursuing groundwater development. Other projects may help Texas improve its D rating for water infrastructure. The TWDB financed over $1 billion in projects identified in the state water plan, including new reservoirs in northern and central Texas. El Paso built a desalination plant and created a facility to turn white wastewater into drinking water as less water overflowed into the Rio Grande River. Water control and ownership. A second environmental battlefront is the citizens versus the state over ownership of surface versus groundwater. Surface water is subject to control and management by the state, but groundwater is owned by the land water of the property above it, known as the right of capture. Yet as the reach of the state grew and water districts popped up around the thirsty state, landowners used the subsurface water was threatened when local groundwater districts attempted to regulate how much water local property owners could pump. The cases ended up in court. The Texas Supreme Court in 2012 sided with landowners, certifying that the state could only issue rules that were reasonable. The lack of clarity about what reasonable means, however, vexes water politics to this day. Water and air pollution. Federal and state agencies track and monitor air pollution in Texas. Congress has passed legislation such as the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, setting standards for state and local governments that are implemented by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Texas elected officials and state agencies have worked to meet these standards, but have often battled the EPA and federal restrictions since the 1970s. At the state level, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the TCEQ, tracks air and water quality, water supply, and waste management, and penalizes violators of state and local regulations. Texas has met national standards for most pollutants, with some notable exceptions. Vehicles, oil refineries, power plants, factories, and other industrial facilities have placed Texas far ahead of every other state in its greenhouse gas emissions. Particularly ozone, the smog, and carbon dioxide. Ozone levels have plagued the Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston metropolitan areas. Houston has dropped from the number 1 to the number 12 spot on the list of top ozone producers, but the city still experienced 21 days of unhealthy smog in 2017, taking its toll on children with asthma and older respiratory diseases. Environmental groups have filed suits against both Texas and the federal government, alleging that both have allowed Texas industries to violate federal regulations. A report from the Environmental Texas called Troubled Waters finds more than 900 instances of industrial facilities releasing pollution at levels beyond federal limits. TCEQ issues fines in excess of $1 billion a year, but a recent analysis carried out by the environmental group shows that while the agency could issue fines as high as $2.3 billion for violations, the agency only levied a total of $1.2 million in fines, or 2 cents per pound of pollution,
Environmental groups charge that the TCEQ fails to hold polluters responsible, and that in recent years the EPA, which hears complaints against the TCEQ, has not challenged the TCEQ effectively. Pollution is not just an urban problem. The state's most contaminated sources of drinking water can be found around farming communities where a hodgepodge of chemicals mix to create a carcinogenic water supply, and crop duster pilots release toxic chemicals in high winds, wafting them into animals and people as well. In one of the windiest places on the planet, West Texas, DNA from antibiotic resistance bacteria in cattle feedlots is airborne. Fecal materials from the cow pen floor dries and then is released in the air, carrying with it antibiotic resistant bacteria that limits doctors' ability to treat life-threatening infections. One resident from Hale Center, who noted the smell from the lots, asked, "But even if I'm not happy about the feed yard, what am I supposed to do? I live here." Excuse me. The economically vulnerable and racial minorities are also susceptible to pollution. In the Charlton Pollard neighborhood of Beaumont, residents' eyes watered with the intense rotten egg smell from ExxonMobil refinery. Lawsuits initiated in 2000 alleged racial discrimination from the TCEQ, which they claimed allowed the plant to release an unsafe amount of emissions into the air. The EPA agreed to install an air monitor, but did not agree to a half-mile green belt between the community and the refinery, or to help in relocation or medical monitoring. Energy sources. Texas is the largest consumer of electricity in the United States, using more than 1/10 of the country's total energy. As the state's population has grown in electricity, demand has grown with it. The need for air conditioning, most of the year a growing energy intensive industrial sector, and longer commutes to work all contribute to significant consumption. How will Texas meet these needs? Texas power needs can be partially satisfied from homegrown natural sources. The state is and has been a leading producer of energy, chiefly from crude oil, natural gas, and wind power, see Table 14.2. Coal use, however, is still part of the energy consumed, accounting for 21% of the state's energy use in 2019, but lower than by wind energy by 1%. In fact, Texas has its own electrical grid, which covers most of the state. This makes Texas unique because it is one of only 3 grids in the entire United States. The grid is run by the Electrical Reliability Council of Texas and is separate in part to avoid interference from the federal government, which sets rates for transmission services and wholesale power. Much of the state's energy independence has resulted from a boom in hydraulic fracturing or fracking in 2012 and 2013, continuing to today, with more than 50% of energy created in natural gas. In 2005, the state legislature passed legislation requiring that 5% of the state's electricity come from renewable resources by 2015. The state has exceeded these goals, with renewable resources accounting for about 10% by 2014, largely because of early investment in wind energy, the turbines of which dot the West Texas plains. Today, Texas leads the nation in wind power capacity with 3 times more than any other state, and wind energy accounting for 1/4 of power generated by wind in the nation. The role of tax incentives.
in encouraging development of alternative energy is often hotly contested. In 2014, the state comptroller provoked controversy when she said that the wind energy industry in the state should stand on its own 2 feet, citing a job already completed and an unfair market advantage. In cheap natural gas, the comptroller advocated for stripping the state's role boosting wind power. In 2015, the Texas legislature considered and rejecting a bill to end subsidies for alternative energy and the creation of transmission lines to deliver the electricity generated by turbines. Despite the state's reputation for oil and gas, Texas is projected to utilize wind turbines to generate up to 37% of its total energy by 2030. The insider view. State governments are often referred to as laboratories for democracy, with the exception that unique circumstances, problems, and events in individual states will encourage tailored policy innovation. A state the size of Texas, with its diverse and unique problems, demands, and range of policy approaches, the development and maintenance of thousands of policies in the Lone Star State illustrate the constantly changing economics, demographics, and preferences of the state. By design, Texas spends less than other states on social services and assistance. Those who support minimal government like it that way, but those who help for a larger safety net, a better funded educational system, and greater regulation of polluters are frustrated. The policy process helps the state find solutions to the problems it confronts, even as debate rages about how to handle these policies. This is the end of Chapter 4, Part 3.